Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. I'm Matthew Schmidt, here as usual with Adam al-Sirgany.
Hello.
And Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
Today we'll be discussing The Art of Translation by Benjamin Alire Sáenz from his 2012 collection Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club. The story follows Nick Guerra, opening in 1985 when he's in the hospital after being beaten by 3 white boys who carve a message on his back. This happens while he's away at college in Albuquerque, and we pick up the thread when he's back home in El Paso. After being released from the hospital, Nick lives with his parents and tries to figure out who he is and what he should do. So I thought we'd start this out by just talking a little bit about Nick, what we know about him, what we learn about him through the story, the assault that he suffers, and maybe a little bit about his family.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start by saying that we don't know much about Nick, and that what we learn about Nick ends up coming through the progression of what's a pretty short timeline, right? Like the story begins in the hospital where Nick is sort of coming to in a haze and realizing that he has a sort of maybe specifically Spanish aphasia, and he can't quite grasp words. And we end the story we don't have a specific number of weeks that we've gone through, but it's long enough that Nick has physically recovered from the assault to the degree that his wounds have scarred over, and he's capable of going to a bar, getting drunk, interacting with other people, having sex. Most of the rest of what we get is actually through what we learn Nick can't remember, or that Nick can no longer do. Right? Maybe I'll let you take that one, Ingrid.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I think, as you said, it's interesting that we start in the hospital and move through the story in the way that we do, in that we initially don't know what's happened to Nick, and we sort of slowly find out. So a line that comes in the first paragraph is, this is him in the hospital interacting with family members. My mother would touch me, hold my hand, whisper words to me, words I couldn't understand. I felt as if I was no longer in control of my own voice, my own body. When my mother looked into my eyes and kissed my forehead, I stared back into her almost familiar face. I could see the hurt in her eyes as she whispered my name, and I felt as if I had become a wound, the source of all her hurt. So I think this story interestingly positions ourselves, like the readers, in a state of confusion, a little bit like Nick's. We can't inhabit his perspective yet. We don't know what's happened to him. But, I come to a line like, I could see the hurt in her eyes, this idea of him being the source of all her hurt. And I don't know what to do with it yet as a reader. I think, interestingly, a lot of what we know about Nick is what he's grappling with, his interior struggle. Another passage that I pulled thinking about his identity, because, actually, like, the details we get from his life, he goes on a jog at one point. The sort of surface details about things he might have done in the past are not as telling as how he's reacting to what's happened to him. So here's an example. I remember the trip back to my old neighborhood, the familiar houses. It was as if I was watching myself get down from the car, watching myself as I stared at my father's neat and perfect lawn. My mother's roses were in bloom, and I thought they were very beautiful, and I spelled out the word beautiful to myself. And I wondered about the origins of that word, and what kind of dreamer had dragged it into the world. So this is something that I could have chosen a lot of passages. I like this one in particular because we get to see a little bit of the neighborhood, but throughout the story, Nick's grappling with his own disconnection, his feelings of like, well, this is familiar, but this is my old life. This is my life before this happened to me. And I'm numbed as a result of what happened to me. I can't connect. I don't know what to do. I am not in the present. I'm not in the future, and I'm not in the past either. I'm nowhere.
Yeah, I think that like that's a really good description of Nick's. Right, what Nick is experiencing is like, in the truest sense, trauma. Right, like it's both something physically that he's going to have to relive, and emotionally that he's going to have to relive through small things. But he's also had this dramatic physiological change happen to him, right? Like he's literally scarred with the words that these people have put on him. And I think in that way, right, like because we're inhabiting Nick's perspective in the first person, we never get that access to that other person. I think, you know, I'd like to think that there's enough grace in the world that Nick gets to reimagine and re-engage whoever that past Nick was. But you know, we know he liked to read. We know that at one time he jogged, and he has jogging shoes. I like to think that like that symbol of jogging. We know that he liked the desert, but now it feels much more threatening than it used to.
And I mean, to your point about reading, he's also preoccupied throughout this story with words. And you know, their meanings. He asks a lot of questions about words. What's interesting is I think the story negotiates his inability to connect with and speak to his present and his questions around that really artfully. You know, there's the ways in which he's inarticulate and unable to kind of grasp what's going on with him, and there are moments of real clarity where he notices that, you know, he doesn't have the same capacity to react with, say, anger that his sister does.
Yeah, but we also don't, I think that's one of the questions, right, is we never get, we know that he would like to be like his sister. His sister has this incredible moment. I can't remember exactly what she says, but there's this sort of media circus that wants to sort of fetishize
I
Nick's,
have it if
yeah,
you want
please.
me to.
Scream it.
I'm the wrong person for that read, but I'll do what I can. When the reporter began taping her segment using our house as a background, I stood in quiet awe of my sister Angela. Angela, by the way, is the sibling. He has 5 siblings that we get the most of on the page. My sister Angela, who stormed out into the yard, grabbed the reporter's microphone, looked into the camera and yelled, "Someone used my brother's back like a goddamn chalkboard. You want to know what they wrote on his back? Is that what you want? You want to know how we feel? We fucking feel like dancing." That last part makes it. I don't see that coming as a reader, and I love it. 'Cause it's so strange.
There's also a humorous moment right after that where Angela throws the reporter's microphone into the neighbor's yard,
Yeah.
and then stares at them before they leave. So I really like how there's some levity thrown in after a horrible encounter.
Yeah.
Like, it immediately adds some humor that doesn't really exist in much of the story at all.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, including because, right, like...
I'm trying to find that other moment that made me laugh. I was dreaming, I said. It rhymes with screaming.
Yeah.
I mean, funny, not funny, but
Yeah, but I think that's important, right? Like, because there are no good guys in this story, right? Like, the news, right? Like, you're sitting around, you're watching CNN or like MSNBC or whatever it is you're watching, and like, you don't sit there and say, like, well, my anxiety pump is being primed. You're watching the news and you're like, it's really important. This is me engaging the critical issues of the day. But that's, I think when someone becomes the narrative around which the rest of us are all going to like have our important connections to things happening in the world, when someone becomes, it's a horrifying thing to like be watched, especially if the thing that's brought you attention is like something real and violent and traumatic, but also, right, like the places that Nick feels capable of going to pursue like human connection again, right, are dingy bars, right, where he ends up like connecting with a woman who like is, using him for his body, and like at his age that might feel appealing if it weren't like also horrific in a way to try and just like let someone touch him again and be connected. And so it turns into a really dark thing. And so I think, like the parents are like good guys. Angela's a good guy, but we don't see them doing much other than like expressing their own manifestations of frustration and fear and sadness and like, faulted attempts at like trying to reconnect, right? Like the father, like as soon as Nick comes back and like comes out and like comes into the kitchen for the first time, like dives straight into a conversation about what he's gonna do with the rest of his life. Like in looking at how rough Nick's scene is, I think it's those little jokes, like however bleak, and you wouldn't want them to be like lighter, right? Like dad jokes just won't do in this circumstance.
Yeah, I think it's really smart how the story also puts us in the role of the media or the person watching media, in that we really do want to know what was carved on his back.
Oh yeah, the entire time it
And,
bothers me.
and we never get to find out.
Yeah,
And, but that is part of the point.
yeah,
I was also thinking a lot about violence in this story. Obviously, we have the moment, which we kind of get briefly in retrospect from Nick, when he was assaulted in Albuquerque, and it happened in the desert. And I was wondering if you saw violence, I felt like it permeated the narrative, and was wondering like where you thought or saw this happening elsewhere.
yeah. I've thought a lot about this question. I think it's like a little tough to dive into and like have the right answer. I think that everything feels so edgy in this story, right? Like including when someone's trying to be comforting, right? Like one of the, like notably, we don't know much about Nick. We don't know his name. We don't know his gender. We don't know like anything about what's happened to him for probably 2.5 pages before it starts to like come together. And I think that's significant insofar as like that's the way his world is coming back together. Right after we start to learn what's happened, we get a page break, and then we dive into the doctor asked me if I knew my name. I looked back at the doctor. I was trying to decide if he was real or if he was just a dream I was having. The doctor looked back at me, stubbornly waiting for an answer. I didn't want to talk to him, but I decided he wasn't a dream and that he wasn't going to go away. Yes, I said, I know my name. You want to tell me what it is? Don't you know? Can you just tell me? My name is Nick. What's your last name? Guerra. What year is it? I decided the doctor wasn't a bad man. He wasn't like the boys. He wasn't going to hurt me. I think I might have smiled at him. Now, we get more of this doctor conversation, but it's coming out of, right, just learning that, like, what Nick's assaulters had shouted at him in his memories, motherfucker, motherfucker, go back, right? I think that what he wants is the doctor to go away as a physical, like, I'm scared, I don't feel safe here. The doctor is not using, like, phenomenal bedside manner with, like, you want to tell me what it is, right? Like, this poor kid has just been, like, brutalized, and the doctor isn't, like, tenderly walking him through this process. He's, like, irritated as if Nick were some punk teenage kid, like, fucking with him, right? And I think that's really, like, there's a lot of little moments like that in the story where people are deeply insensitive, right? Like Sylvia, the woman that Nick ends up sleeping with, right? Like, gets, if I told someone I didn't want to take my shirt off in bed, right? Like, I would want them to go, okay, right? Like, she's immediately defensive about the fact of that. I mean, those, like, little, they're small things, right? It's not having words carved in your back. It's not, right? Like, it's not, it's not someone telling you to fuck yourself or, like, beating you or even, like, low grade slapping you. But, like, there's something about this set of circumstances, like, explicating the highly traumatic event that draws to the fore all of those little tiny inhumanities or failures to see someone that make all of it feel so much worse. But, like, of course, on any given day, you're cranky, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that someone did something terrible to you, right? Like, someone just, like, says something about your hair being, like, messy, and it can, like, wound you in some really deep way, when on any other day it would just be something casual and stupid somebody said. And it's so context dependent, right? Like, we don't actually, I think science does something incredible by giving no description of the doctor's physical bedside manner, right? We have no idea, like, what his face is doing. We don't know where his hands are, right? Like, we just hear that, like, flat phrasing, and without tonality, it feels brutal.
I think that's well put. And, I guess I would add that, there is that low level violence and sensitivity to violence that runs through the story. And, I mean, some of that's to do with the way in which all of these characters are differently traumatized and differently kind of moving at different paces and responding in different ways to that trauma. So, at the end of that scene that Adam read with the doctor touches Nick's shoulder and he flinches, which is described as a reflex. Doctor says, steady, the doctor whispered. No one's going to hurt you here. His smile was kind and it almost made me want to cry. You're going to be just fine, Nick. To me, the doctor's bedside manner wasn't especially bad. It wasn't, something to write home about, but it's the sensitivity that makes it feel so electric. And, if I had to choose one word to describe, like, how these characters are moving through this story, I think the first one I would go to is flinch.
Yeah.
They're reacting nervously to the phone, to the door, and sometimes bursting out with violence in response to that, as Angela did. Nick, as I've said, is numbed throughout a lot of this story. I thought it was really interesting that he wanted Angela's anger, he wanted her tears, and partly because I often, when my own brother and sister are going through something, I want to assume it for them. And I was just struck by the very different place that Nick's coming from. That it's not that he is worried for Angela in that moment, and I mean, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but that he wants to feel something again. So I mean, there's at once this extreme sensitivity to, I mean, even very usual things happening in the story, and there is this intense numbing working together concurrently. I think this is getting ahead, but I'm gonna go for it. In terms of like some of how the story concludes, Nick begins to think about the hatred that the white boys who attacked him had for him, and he wants to rethink his own reaction to them, what he should have done in that moment, and he thinks about sacrificing himself to that hate. I'll read a little because it's so beautiful and well put. What I should have done when they were holding me down, what I should have done when they took that knife and wrote on me as if the knife were merely a pen in my own blood, nothing more than ink. What I should have done, I should have looked at my attackers and told them I had been waiting for them. I should have looked them all in the eyes and told them I knew their hate, understood it, embraced its awful necessity. I should have offered up my body as a sacrifice to their cruel and hungry gods. It was a war, after all, and sacrifices were necessary in a war, though I had never acknowledged that the war existed. I think there's something about this conclusion that feels really right to me. I think, I've never experienced anything like Nick in this story, but to the degree that I've, brushed with trauma, I think there is the feeling that there's sort of a war on. I think, in terms of this narrator's fixation with naming, with his own name, with language, it feels like it lands in the right spot there. But I think in terms of violence and how it culminates, that feels like the moment to mention that, he's thinking about this hatred and what to do with it and what to do with different words. And there's this final feeling that, like, there's nothing, I've read a little bit about, like, Joseph Brodsky say and how he reacts to his trauma, and I mean, some of it's like kind of thumbing the nose at attackers and turning their attack ridiculous. I think in this story, the trauma is much more raw, and that sacrifice feels really right for the trajectory we've moved through.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that we might be remiss in saying, and I feel like it's a little bit my fault, or in not saying, I feel like it's a little bit my fault, is that, right, like, obviously, right, the key violent act is a group of people, right, like, beating Nick, holding Nick down, and collectively deciding that it's a good idea to carve words in Nick's back. There are other moments of violence, right, like, toward the end of the story, the woman that Nick sleeps with throws an ashtray at his back after an argument that's more or less about his inability to take his shirt off in bed. And then, right, like, there's also all these people who, to what that war is metaphorically, or what that war is, as literalized through a racialized attack, right? That were in a border town throughout the story, sometimes on the American side, sometimes on the Mexican side, right? And, right, like, this is a story where people call up, like, Nick's family, not just to show support, right? Like, he mentions that a large part of the calls they get are support, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we also, like, get, reports of like people calling to accuse Nick of having done something, right? Which is also part of the like media violence that gets engaged in here, right? Like because the media has paid attention to Nick, because the news cycle has picked Nick's story up, people feel compelled to be supportive of Nick, and Nick, without trying, without communicating at all, becomes, right, like an object of pathos and pity, and gets propagandized into the position of representing the abused minority, with which, right, like presumably white people react by going like, he had to do something, like, which is, right, is so polarizing and so aggressive and so like indicative of that, like this,
alienating.
yeah, and also like the kind of thing that like if you're ever going to do something and snap off, right, like it's that idea that you must have done something, therefore, like, and that the violence might come and get you anyway, right? Like, is your oppressor always trying to bait you into that moment where you respond with violence and they get to go, oh yeah, look, he did do something. And on some level, that's where Nick gets at the end of the story, right? He feels like there was a war and he should have like become that, but he also does something slightly transcendent by imagining it as a sacrifice rather than as combat.
I'm so glad you clarified there. I think crucial to understand that part of why they're afraid of the phone ringing is, the constant sympathy, this constant questions, the constant engagement with this event, even when it's well-meaning and kind, but also, an anonymous caller, this is an example from the story, saying they didn't exactly lynch him, did they? And things like that.
Yeah. It's horrifying.
Yes. Gosh.
Yeah. Well, Borders was mentioned.
The transition.
And, there is the border. The telephone acts as a border of its own.
Yeah.
In its way. But clearly, as Adam has stated, some of this takes place, the majority probably takes place in El Paso, and then there are, Sylvia lives in Juarez, and so Nick visits her there at least a couple times. And so I was thinking about Borders, obviously, because the story places us there, at the border, a border, and Nick crosses that border multiple times, and I was curious to hear what you both thought of concerning borders within the story.
I love this question. It got me thinking kind of creatively, maybe tangentially, about different binaries within this story. I didn't just think about physical borders. I thought about kind of like the lines between characters and different kinds of divides. One thing that Nick has to say about the boys who hurt him is, this comes pretty early in the story too, that they spoke a different language, and it was not a language I understood. As Nick's making sense of different words and their meaning.
What do you think he means by that?
I think he's referring specifically to hate, which is part of why the conclusion of this story hits as hard as it does. That he can't understand not their literal language, but their way of being, their way of engaging him. I guess you could literalize it as the writing on his back, but I think it's more like their way of looking at him, their way of encountering the world is the thing he doesn't understand. And instead of creating a firm divide between him and them, he talks about hate living inside of him and like what they did living inside of him, and nesting, I think is the metaphor. But I mean, he ends up kind of breaking down that particular border and letting the hatred in, but in an unusual way, a way that I don't think those boys would understand finally. So, I mean, it gets to be a very foldy kind of border. And I think likewise the physical borders in the story, there's a lot of thinking around the word home. His parents are constantly saying about El Paso, you're home now, you're safe, in so many words. Because this act of violence was in Albuquerque, and I sense Nick's willingness in his numbed state to repeat that sort of mantra to himself, but his own hesitancy around that. At one point he says, it was as though all the sound had been banished from the world, and the words and the laughter that had been sent back to Mexico, and I'd been forced to stay in this foreign land that hated me. I think there's the sense after this that home isn't a home, that he doesn't belong exactly anywhere. And I mean, especially given how fraught his salliances, is that a word? I'm thinking of like sallying across the border, which is a weird way of putting it.
Yeah.
Dalliances? Maybe I'm muddling those two. Anyway.
Gets into dalliances and he sallies a little in the story.
I guess I'm trying to say that in terms of crossing the border, it's not that that's a total like wonderful refuge, haven, and escape for him. He does talk about Sylvia, the older woman he meets, and her name meaning forest, and wanting to like maybe get lost in her for a while, but she really, as Adams noted, does not prove to be a safe person, or that space a safe space for him.
We should also say that Nick's last name, Guerra, means war.
Right.
We didn't really
Right,
explicitly
yes.
say that at the beginning.
Although Nick explicitly says it in the beginning,
Yes.
and it seems to bum him out to realize that that doesn't mean that you win the war.
Right.
Yeah, I think that Ingrid's on to something, as you are with the phone, right? Like that there are so many permeable borders within the context of this story. There's home and there's not. We're on the U.S.-Mexico border, which is an artificial construct, right? Like anyone who's like been along it realizes that there are parts where there's nothing actually dividing those two spaces except, an abstract like notion that like some surveyor has laid out at some point, that we've put on maps and that we're defensive about in those ways. And I think that, the languages are borders, and I mean, this is always a thing that's like fascinated me in terms of, I grew up with parents who spoke other languages, but who never actively taught me those languages. And so, right, like my relationship to the words of those languages is not sort of code switching, is like in my like messy bank of a mind, like there's just some like smattering of this word here, or if I need this word, I have it, or I have this phrase here. Whereas Nick does, right, like it's hard for me to know whether or not the sort of loss of Spanish, or his concern with whether or not he's translating Spanish correctly, is a sort of traumatic refusal to re-engage that like linguistic heritage after being assaulted in a way that like focused on race and like that difference is an issue, or whether there's something medical that's happened there. It's outside my pay grade to like even venture a guess there. But I do know that many people actually do like categorize languages in their heads as here's where Spanish is, here's where Italian is, right? And so on and so forth. And I think that permeability ends up being in Nick literally will list out words and like think out those. I looked up more words: sex, kiss, hand, tongue. No dictionary could translate the needs of the human body, right? Like I think he's trying to find these spaces that are liminal and will allow him to interact with both of those things in the aftermath, and whether or not that's metaphorical or not isn't that critical, right? But we also, I mean, we get elements of this in terms of age, right? Like there's something infantilizing about being abused in any way. And right, like as soon as Sylvia comes on hard immediately when Nick walks into a bar, and like the bartender like teases her about like a little young for you, and right, like that actually becomes a thing for him in his mind, right? Like someone else has applied that thing, and he realizes that she's not in her late 20s or 30s, but is in her 40s, which is something he's decided. It's not something he asks her, right? The ease with which they like end up going to bed together freaks him out on some level, and he feels bad. He thinks that she's a prostitute. He feels like he has to pay her, and then she gets mad at him for having like done that fair game, right? Like, but also she's like mad about that because there is something that like about the idea that like of the ownership of that sex in a way that like prostitution is not cool, right? But being like someone who's empowered through her sexuality is cool, and those for her are mutually exclusive, right? I don't know what Nick's like philosophical thinking is about that. But like those little moments are constantly there where someone becomes defined by age, by profession, by right, like which side of the border they're on in any given thing. And I think that's an incredibly powerful aspect of the story, right? Even when we translate, or even when Nick translates, right? Like he doesn't know for sure. He's worried about his own translations, and it's an identity crisis after losing that first half of himself.
Yeah, we do learn throughout the story that when he was younger, he told his parents he was going to learn every word in the world. Like he's reading the dictionary, and it's putting him in this situation does beg the question of identity and culture, I think, in that he's bilingual at least.
Yeah.
We don't know if he knows anymore, but coming from Mexico to the United States, we're not told whether he's reading, a Spanish or an English dictionary, but because he can speak both languages and because he translates kind of back and forth a bit during the book, I think we can maybe get to the point where it's like, he's reading both dictionaries and he's trying to learn all the words. And like, if you can learn all the words in the world, that includes a lot of languages. But I think, moreover, like when he's younger, which we don't really see other than like some of the things that he talks about with his parents, is that he was naive in a good way. Like naive in the way that he's a sweet person. He kisses his father on the head, and this is after he's kind of finally trying to get back into the world after being bedridden for several weeks at least. And he kind of says, I don't know why I did that. It seemed like the right thing to do, which seems to me to be like the whoever he was before kind of like showing themselves again.
Yeah.
Um, and so the interactions that he has, particularly with Sylvia, um, are interesting to me because, you know, it's not that they speak different languages, so to speak,
Yeah.
but they don't understand each other,
Yeah.
nonetheless. And, you know, I think about that, and I think about the fact that when he was attacked initially, he'd simply stepped out to mail a letter. Again, words in the letter,
Right.
right? So all of this is kind of swirling around, um, you know, culture, identity, and, you know, Nick really, as Ingrid has said, um, worries about language a lot and thinks about language a lot throughout the story. And he wonders if he's an impersonator of himself. He wonders, um, you know, whether his assailants misspelled what they carved into his back.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, so I was thinking, what do you make of the title, The Art of Translation? And you know, especially in conjunction with the beliefs that Nick talks about throughout the story concerning language.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about how we're talking about violence even as we're having a conversation about it, right? Like, and I think in some ways, right, there's a difference between violence and aggression, right? Like, what Angela does in defense of Nick, I don't think is violence, right? I think it's an aggressive action to scare away people who are, like, pushing the limits. And, like, I think that's a very different thing than even, right, like, at one point, Sylvia tells Nick that he's a fucked up kid, right? And it's a response to feeling dismissed by him and, like, feeling like she doesn't have access to him, which is a weird thing for someone to expect from a one night stand, right? And I think that there's, like, very different kinds of engagement that happen there. I think, to your point about the ways those interactions fail, right? Like, it's not just getting a word from English to Spanish or Spanish to English. It's about getting that there in a way that makes sense, right? And that makes someone comprehend you. At one point, right, Nick's being asked by the doctor, like, it might be a nurse, by one of the medical staff, like, what year it is, right? 1985. The doctor nodded and smiled, and I wondered if he had a son. Who's the president? I closed my eyes. Ronald Reagan. Who's the vice president? Bush. Is it Bush? Does it matter? Right? Like, there's something about, right, like, the questions that we ask that are supposed to be basic, the things that we know that are supposed to be basic, that are very, you know, different person to person, right? Like, we don't know enough about Nick to know whether or not, you know, I've taught college-age students and been shocked to discover that many of them don't know who the vice president is, right? And I think that that's, you know, like, I think that's always tricky, right? There's something about getting all of those little nuances across, but it's also, you have to have created that borderline in order to get it across, right? Like, I think the reality of how anyone speaks a language, or the reality of how any of those communicative things happen, is that there's something in my head that I think I know, and I have to know that I know it, right? In my head, I always know what I'm talking about, right? Which is never true, right? Like, I'm usually deeply
Clearly.
confused, right? And I'm telling you something, And I assume you do or don't know, and there's a degree to which you understand, right? There's like this whole spectrum of the thing, which is actually how language works if we don't reinforce artificial borders, right? Like, we don't say this is the American line. We're going to teach English in school. That's going to be the dominant line, right? You have to like use those elements of force. I think the art thing has to do with like this human like empathy and seeing an effort you have to put in to actually get there, right? Like, the reason things go so bad with Sylvia is essentially that like Nick is suffering. He can't say out loud the thing, so it can't be understood. And if it were understood, Sylvia does not seem like the sort of person who knows how to go like, okay, I understand that must be a real difficult thing for you, and like walk through in a healthy way whether or not any of this should be going on, right? Like, she just immediately gets mad, right? Like, and I think what all of this is about. It's so much less about the language for me, and so much more about how all these kinds of communication are failing, you know?
Well, I just want to say quickly that even when someone says something and you hear it and you understand it, doesn't mean you understand it.
Yeah.
In that, like, okay, you've taken the information in, but then, like, a couple days later, like, they say something else, or you, like, see something and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
now I see what they're talking about. Like, I did understand them initially, but not to the degree that they meant.
Yeah.
I think there's so much wisdom in this story that kind of hides itself behind the story's frankness in that way. You know, when we talked about Sebald in a different episode, we talked about Austerlitz, a book that none of us have read yet, and what he says about it. It's on the list, I assure you all. And, you know, some of what he says about writing about the Holocaust is that you can't roll it out on every page, that you have to come to it sidelong. And, you know, in this wonderful interview with Michael Silverblad, Sebald speaks about this directly, and, you know, talks about the feeling like he has to let readers know what's on his narrator's mind. But that may not always be, you know, directly the Holocaust, because it's such a big thing to be dealing with it. This story moves differently, and I think it can be easy to miss in the way that, you know, we miss in life all the time. Like, what does a word really mean? How many times do people ask you, you know, what a $5 word means, and when pressed, it's tough to define. You use it all the time. Or, I mean, this story is much concerned with simpler words. After those phone calls and content around that, we get this line. I asked myself if sympathy was a good word or a bad word. You know, I mean, out of this trauma, out of this disconnection with language, we actually get a very deep connection with language. A willingness to stand back and look at a word and think through, is this a good word? Is it a bad word? At this point in the story, we do get binary there. We don't get, is it an in-between word? But, you know, I'm on page 52 of our copy. By page 53, the amount of ground we cover with regard to translation and words is remarkable. So we get that question, we get him looking up the word illegal, and then we pretty quickly come to this paragraph. Everything felt like it was happening to someone else. The newspaper, people, and the journalists. They didn't want to speak to me. They wanted to speak to a Nick who no longer existed. The dead couldn't speak. Didn't they know that? The thought occurred to me that the living were exhausted from the weight of the words they were forced to carry with them everywhere they went. I at least felt free of the weight of words. Why don't you talk, Nick? That's a question that his mother asks him. It's called to. The mother is a wonderful character in this story. We haven't talked much about, and I see her as a kind of, in fairy tale terms, magical helper for Nick. She's his mother, but she's also someone there to check his reality and to care for him and to remind him of what his reality has been and continues to be.
Yeah, I think in one of the great moments of like the story bringing the real up against the metaphorical, which is a constant translating of its own kind that it's doing. Right. Sometimes the odors that came out of my mother's kitchen made me want to live. Taste lies on the tongue, but it is beyond the reach of language. That's what I wrote down on a piece of paper. I stared at what I had written. I ripped up the piece of paper until all the words were indecipherable. Those are, I think they're little moments like that, but like many of the moments in the story, like really the first moment in the story, right? Like we see Nick looking out at his mother or something that his mother has done, and it like alters his experience.
Yeah, and that moment comes directly after what I just read, and also comes, it's to do with food and the things his mother is making, and what he says about that also is it reminds me that having a body wasn't always a bad thing. So he's feeling disembodied. The mother's food connects him back to that thing she's doing. And then a scene right after that, his mother comes into his room, and she says, "I thought you'd be reading." And he says, "I don't want to read anymore." And she says, "You told me you couldn't live without books. You said you wanted to learn all the meanings of every word that existed in the world." He says, "I don't remember saying that. It must have been a long time ago." She says, "No, Nick, it wasn't long ago at all." And they have this wonderful moment of connection after that. He kind of back in his body and engaged with his past, reminded by his mother of what his reality is, has a moment where he breaks down and feels and cries and lets her rock him to sleep.
Well, speaking of reality, Nick
Right on.
Nick is concerned with normality. He talks about the word normal and what normal things are to do, what normal people do. And, it has to do with how we talk to each other, what is expected of us, and what we expect of others. And so I'm interested to hear how you think normality has or has not shaped Nick, what your definition of normality is. We have all these, news stories that are like, this is the new normal. This is the new normal, and maybe just talk a little bit about the story as well. Like, what kind of a story is this? Is this a normal story? I know that's a loaded question. I realize that. But maybe you could instead maybe talk about the story and what it's doing and how it's doing it.
Yeah, I suspect that one reason you chose this story for us to discuss is that I think this story works more like a poem than a story, right?
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. And, Sáenz is also a really talented poet, so
Right.
Get out there and read some of his work there. But, in some ways, like, this story does everything that if you were in, like, an intro to creative writing fiction class, people would tell you don't do. Like, don't start in the hospital. Don't start from the perspective of a character who's out of it. Like, don't go high drama. Like, I think even the choice of words that, like, often Nick is thinking about, pretty intense, right? Coraje, odio, trabajo, sangre, corazón, muerte. Like, goddamn, any of those things, if you told me they were in the story, I'd be like, I'm not sure I want to read that. But I think, it's so artfully and incredibly well pulled off. What Sáenz does is interweave these moments in a way that, like, bring these thoughts to the fore and do create levity out of moments that shouldn't be funny but somehow rise above the surrounding horrors, that allow horrors to exist and something to come out of them, to allow something as sort of metaphorically and physically fraught as writing on someone to be something worth exploring, both as Nick's individual human tragedy and this metaphor for these larger issues of race and like our ideas of border, our ideas of language, without doing that horrifying news thing where Nick becomes a sort of like object representation of why the world is fucked up in X way. I think the normal question is hard for me because, right, like, I don't know, what is it, like 5th, 6th grade, maybe before that, when you learn the difference between like mean, median, mode, right? Like, that like, even in math, averages aren't like uniform, you know? But I'm gonna go back to this moment because it's the thing I keep, both because it's a profound moment to me in this story, but also because I think it's the moment where this normal question like really hits the wall, you know? This is a moment between Sylvia and Nick. I went home with her. Our sex was angry, more like a fight than sex. And even though there was plenty of life in the sex, there was no love. There was no love at all. Not that I was surprised. When I fell asleep, I woke up as she was trying to take off my shirt. I fucking said no, I said. Just get out, she yelled. Just get the fuck out. You're a fucked up kid. I didn't say a word as I finished putting on my clothes. She was right. I was fucked up. You're fucked up, she said again. I heard you the first time. I felt a sharp pain on my back as I moved toward the door. I tried not to wince, tried not to show any sign of pain as I started at the glass ashtray that had bounced off my back and had fallen to the floor with a thud. Who's more fucked up, me or you? Is it a contest? The look on her face, it reminded me of the look on the faces of those boys, the rage in it, the hate. I took a deep breath and walked out the door. I think that, like, first of all, I want it known that is a typo in the book. It's pain as I started at the glass is how it's written in the book. Because there's so many people out there judging me for that. But no, I think, right, like, there's something about that, right, like, this, is it a contest of who's more fucked up, right? Like, I mean, we say shit like that all the time, that, like, shouldn't have an effect on us, right? Like, it's sort of meaningless, but is to say, in some way, you're out of line, right? Like, these two people have known each other for a matter of hours, getting drunk, had a one-night stand, they have a repeat one-night stand, at which point this woman is so mad that he won't take off his shirt. She's got to know why, so she's like snooping while he's sleeping, right? Like, and I'm not sure any of that is or isn't normal, right? Like, which is a weird thing about sexuality. It's a weird thing about the privacy of our bodies that we don't like, because when we talk to each other, right, like, we talk in often grandiose metaphors about how big is it, how long was it, like, you know, how hot was it, like, whatever, like, or even like, was it good or was it bad, right? Like, these kind of platonic binaries that make no sense, right? But also don't give us anything like a portrait of what normal would be, even if we were trying to achieve it. So the idea of normal in this story, I think, is an amplified version of the kind of normal that we're always looking for, which is like, what the hell is normal based on all of the bullshit we tell each other every day while we're trying to sneak in and look at the other stuff, and then getting angry at each other because you're as fucked up as I am when I look behind the curtain a little bit, and I'd rather blame you for it because you made me feel weird than I would like tell you like it's okay and that's normal. Not Nick is not normal, right? Like he's not normal insofar as like something horrifying happened to him, but the response of feeling as fucked up as he doesn't feel abnormal at all, right? And like I don't know anything about Sylvia other than like the things that we see on the page of her when she's drunk or like half drunk and arguing with Nick or sleeping with Nick. And I think that's part of it, right? Like that fantasy of getting back to normal is really like, or even the fantasy that like life stopped at that point, a border was created, and like if only you could talk again, right? Like it's not how life works. It's something horrifying happened to Nick, and that was part of the progression of life. And what normal looks like moving forward is a life in which that becomes part of the flow and Nick moves towards something else, and that desire to go back I think is a normal desire, but it's also the one that never allows it to be stable.
The funniest thing you said is that it's a normal desire by like moving that
Yeah.
and qualifying the desire with normal. And I know it's really interesting to me only because you probably chose that word because it was readily available because we've been talking about normal.
Yeah.
But that just shows like your point.
Yeah.
You know, at the same time.
No, it's a weird thing. Like,
yeah,
I hadn't thought about that when I said it.
Normal, I believe, this story's notions of normal are kind of come at from some different angles. The first time we get normal is Nick reflecting on a new routine after running for a little while and starting to work at a cafe. He says, I liked my new routine, running in the morning, going to work in the evening. It almost didn't matter that nothing happened in between. Sometimes I wanted to go out after work. Going out sounded like something normal. I wanted normal, but something about normal scared me. Walking down streets at night, something bad would happen. But there was this bar that all the waiters talked about at some dive called the Regal Beagle. I wanted to go normal. After that, there are a few instances where he punctuates some kind of action or decision with normal. For me, what I see is someone who is actually taking some comfort in routine and ritual, which I think can be a deep source of comfort, whether you have been traumatized or not, but certainly if you have been kind of building a new life with some predictability and stability about it, seems normal and wise. I think where Nick starts to struggle is with notions of normalcy that are about expectations that are cultural and social, about things that he may or may not want that are, age appropriate, things he should be doing. And I think that's complicated by the fact that he's afraid of things. It's going out to the bar, it's hard for him to make sense of whether he wants that or not because there's an element of fear to it. Going to your question of whether this is a normal story, I agree. I think it breaks a lot of quote-unquote rules for short stories. It is poetic in the way it operates, and its kind of angularity and attention to words, and I mean in the way that it reminded me in its treatment of dialogue, especially of Hemingway. It's really spare, and people always say that Hemingway has a great ear for dialogue. I don't always know about that. I think he leans toward a little over formal. Maybe it would have been stronger to readers in his time. Some of it feels a little dated to me at times, but I think something he does incredibly well is his dialogue isn't always to the point. Characters aren't always talking about the same thing, and it's lovely when it gets to its barest, and I think this story's got that quality too. In terms of some of my favorite moments in this story, there are a few that are very typical of a short story and a few that are very typical of poem traditionally. One that comes very early is when Nick is in bed at the hospital. He names his 5 brothers and sisters and then counts them. And then he does that again, and I think there's something about the cadence of that and the unusualness of that move that feels more poetic to me, feels really surprising and exciting, and prepares me for some of the repetition we're going to get in terms of words that he's questioning the meaning of later. In terms of other moments that are a little more typical of the short story, while we do get scene here, we don't get very much description of setting or like a moment where we're really grounded in place. There's a moment where Nick pauses, and it's so brief, but he looks at a photo, and it's him with an Easter basket and his sister kissing him. And there's something about the visual of that, and a visual that lives in a story that is so much about interiority and dialogue and scenes that have a lot of life to them, but not necessarily like a concrete object to focus on. I love seeing Nick stop in that moment, and I love that, I'm sure there are PhDs out there that would love to like read into Matthew, like the symbolism of that, but I think it's happy as an image just to be the Easter basket as well. Another moment is that I love that I think is kind of a happy marriage between poetic tradition and the short story is the moment where all the adults are going outside to listen to thunder. I think there's something about that and the unusualness of that particular ritual, and its more positive connotations, but also the kind of natural imagery that we get that is at once poetic and very much grounded in scene and kind of nature's magic.
Yeah, right around that point, he has 5 paragraphs that are all one line, much like a poem.
Yeah, I love that moment. That's
Days, weeks, months of nothing but sun. Paragraph. The learning to live without water. Paragraph. The parched land. Paragraph. The waiting. Paragraph. And then the rain. Paragraph. And you hardly ever see that in a story.
It's so weird.
And it's, it throws you off like the first time you read it and you're like, wait a minute, what am I doing here? Like I just was transported to like some other place. And he does that a couple of times in here. And like the end of the story that Ingrid read, where he talks about he should have looked at his attackers and so forth, it acts like a volta.
It does.
It's really interesting to think about it in those terms, especially because when this book came out, he had 5 poetry collections or so already published, along with a slew of other books in multiple genres. And I think it's really neat, the section we talked about where his mother's cooking, and that brings him back to life. In that it isn't so much that food brings him back to life, it's that, something from, the people you love. It reminds you of who you were. And when we say, oh, I'm going home, I'm going to get a home-cooked meal, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, it's going to be this one thing or this other thing. It's like, no, you got to go home and see your family. And that's really what matters. Obviously, it's more complicated than that for all of us, but there is still something like, dare I say, precious in that, particular idea that we have, that we use as a metaphor.
Indeed.
Well, thanks for joining us today. I hope you go out and check some signs out, whether it's Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, one of his novels, one of his children's books, one of his poetry collections. He's got a lot of stuff out there. And we will see you next time.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew.